Welcome to Echoes of Storyland. Before starting, please hit the like button and subscribe so we can continue making stories like this. The day started like any other. The sun was just beginning to rise over the small suburban neighborhood. Birds were chirping in the trees, and the neighborhood was still quiet, with only the occasional sound of a car passing by. Sarah, a single mother in her early 30s, had just finished preparing breakfast for her young daughter Emily. Max, her golden retriever, had been a part of their family for over 5 years. He was loyal, protective, and always a source of joy for Emily, who had grown up alongside him. Max was more than just a dog to them, he was family. Sarah had let Max outside early that morning just before breakfast, to let him stretch his legs in the backyard. The yard was fenced in, a simple but effective barrier to keep Max within the safety of their property. After a few minutes, Sarah called out to him, but he didn't come inside. She assumed he was just enjoying the cool morning air, perhaps sniffing around or chasing a squirrel. After a few more calls with no response, she went outside to check on him. To her shock, Max was nowhere to be found. His collar lay on the ground near the back gate, the clasp unbuckled and open, but no sign of him anywhere. The gate, which had always been securely latched, was slightly ajar. Panic set in as Sarah quickly scanned the backyard, calling Max's name, her voice growing more frantic with each passing second. She ran around the house, checking every corner and even calling out to the neighbors, but there was no sign of him. Sarah's mind raced. Could Max have wandered off? He was a well-behaved dog who never strayed too far from the house. She checked the street in front of their home, hoping to see him trotting down the sidewalk, but the street was empty. No barking in the distance, no sign of movement. As the hours passed, the sinking feeling in her stomach grew. She called animal shelters, put up flyers and posted on social media, hoping someone would spot him. But despite all her efforts, Max remained missing. Neighbors began to get involved, offering help and asking if Sarah had noticed anything unusual, but no one had seen him. The idea that someone might have taken him crossed Sarah's mind, but it didn't make sense. Max was always friendly but never aggressive. He didn't trust strangers easily, especially not enough to let anyone take him. And the collar? Why was it found just lying there as if he had been taken without a struggle? By nightfall, Sarah's hope began to fade, but she refused to give up. She couldn't. Max had been with them through thick and thin, and she couldn't just sit idly by while he was out there somewhere. The next few days were a blur. Sarah couldn't sleep, constantly waking up in the middle of the night to listen for a bark or the sound of paws padding down the hallway. The community rallied behind her, helping to search the surrounding areas, calling local vets, and even bringing in search dogs. The police were called in to help, though they were limited in what they could do. Max had vanished without a trace, and there was no real evidence to suggest that foul play had occurred. Every night, Sarah checked the backyard, hoping that somehow, Max would be waiting for her when she opened the door. But as the days passed, the neighborhood began to feel emptier. The barking of other dogs in the distance only served to remind her of what she had lost. Each time Sarah thought she could no longer handle the uncertainty, she found herself walking the same route through the woods near their home, retracing Max's steps. She visited the park they often frequented, the places Max loved most. She even considered calling a psychic, desperate for any clue, any sign, that might lead her to her beloved dog. But nothing ever came of it. Weeks passed with no word. Flyers went unnoticed, and social media posts were buried beneath other people's updates. It felt like everyone else had moved on, but Sarah couldn't. How could she? Max had been her companion through everything, the ups, the downs, the joy, and the heartbreak. To lose him like this without knowing what had happened felt like a piece of her heart had been ripped away. Max's disappearance wasn't just the loss of a pet, it felt like the loss of a part of her family, a companion who had been there for her when no one else was. The thought that something terrible might have happened to him, that he could be suffering somewhere, haunted Sarah's thoughts every day. Was he alone and scared? Was he hurt? Her mind spiraled through endless possibilities, each one darker than the last. But she couldn't give in to despair. She had to believe that Max was out there, somewhere, waiting to come home. As the weeks turned into a month, Sarah's hope began to falter. The search efforts slowed and the support of the community started to dwindle. Max was just another missing dog, another tragic story with no resolution. The grief began to settle in as a dull ache in her chest. It wasn't just the physical absence of Max, but the emotional toll of not knowing the truth. She couldn't accept the idea that he was gone, but she didn't know how to move forward either. Max had been a constant in her life, and now she had to learn how to exist without him. But then, just as she was starting to lose herself in the daily monotony of life without Max, something unexpected happened. It was a morning like any other, the sun casting its early light through the trees in Sarah's backyard. She had been sitting on the back porch, staring out at the empty yard, when she heard something, a sound so familiar it made her heart skip a beat. It was a bark, faint but unmistakable. Sarah froze. Could it be? Could it possibly be Max? It was early morning when Sarah first heard that distant bark, but it was enough to reignite the flame of hope that had been dimming for weeks. She leapt off the porch, her heart pounding as she hurried to the source of the sound. Her feet carried her instinctively to the edge of the woods behind their house, where Max had once chased squirrels, barked at passing cars, and explored every nook and cranny. As she pushed through the underbrush, she called his name in a voice that trembled with anticipation and dread. Max. Max, where are you? The bark came again, slightly louder but still distant, as if teasing her, pushing her deeper into the forest. With every step she took, Sarah's mind raced. Could it really be him? Had he been hiding out here all along? Maybe he had been too scared to return, or maybe he had been trapped somewhere she hadn't thought to look. The possibilities flooded her thoughts, and for a brief moment, the overwhelming despair she'd felt over the past month began to fade. She could almost see it now, Max emerging from the trees, wagging his tail and bounding toward her, his eyes full of that familiar warmth and loyalty. But the farther she ventured into the woods, the more the landscape shifted, and that initial spark of hope began to wane. The trees were denser here, the ground softer and wetter from recent rain. The air was thick with moisture, and the sounds of the forest seemed to close in around her. Max's bark echoed once more, but now it seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. Sarah hesitated, her heart racing in her chest as a strange sense of unease crept over her. It wasn't just the sudden isolation of the woods that unnerved her, it was the feeling that something was wrong, that the barking was leading her somewhere she wasn't prepared to go. But she couldn't stop herself. She pushed forward, her legs aching, her breath coming in quick gasps. The thought of Max being so close, of finally finding him, was too much to resist. As she rounded a bend in the trail, something caught her eye. Movement. Through the dense foliage she saw something shifting. A figure? No, it was too small to be a person, but it was unmistakably alive. The small form of an animal, its fur blending into the trees, darted past her and then vanished again. It was too quick to identify, but Sarah had seen enough to know it wasn't Max. She stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding louder now, her breath quick and shallow as she tried to calm herself. Her mind raced with possibilities. Had someone else been living in these woods? Were there wild animals hiding here? Or was it simply a figment of her imagination? But before she could contemplate further, Max's bark rang out again, this time much closer. It was then that Sarah saw it. A faint trail of paw prints, freshly pressed into the damp earth, snaked its way deeper into the forest. Her heart leaped, and without a second thought, she followed the trail. The prints were clearly from Max. His distinctive large paw prints left a clear path, leading her through the thick woods. She kept walking, pushing through the trees, the noise of the forest all around her. Her focus was entirely on the prints, her eyes fixed on the ground ahead. But as she walked further, the trail seemed to lead her off the beaten path, down into a part of the woods she had never explored before. The trees grew denser, their branches twisting together like the fingers of ancient hands, blocking out much of the sunlight. It was growing darker, the shadows of the forest creeping in, despite the early morning hour. As she neared the end of the trail, Sarah saw it, a large, craggy rock formation nestled between two towering oaks. The prints led directly to it. But there was no sign of Max. No barking, no movement. Just silence. Her stomach tightened, and the weight of uncertainty pressed on her chest. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air, as if something was wrong. She circled the rock formation, inspecting every crevice, calling Max's name over and over again, but nothing. And then, through the dense brush, she noticed something odd, a faint, musty scent that she recognized from her previous search of the area. It was the smell of wet earth but mixed with something else, something metallic like iron. She knelt down, her fingers brushing the wet leaves beneath her, and suddenly her hand landed on something cold and smooth. A piece of metal. A lock. Her breath caught in her throat. What could this be? She pulled the metal piece from the ground and it became clear. It was part of a cage, a rusted old cage that had been partially buried by time and nature. Her heart began to race again, but this time, it wasn't from excitement. It was fear. Fear of what she might uncover. Fear of what might have happened to Max during the time he'd been missing. Suddenly, a movement caught her eye. Max's bark echoed once more, but it was muffled now, as if it were coming from inside the rock formation. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She rushed forward, her eyes scanning the rocks. And there, hidden behind a thick tangle of vines and moss, was a narrow opening in the rock wall, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The air around the opening was dense, heavy with the scent of damp earth. She could hear Max's bark more clearly now, coming from within. Without hesitation, Sarah crawled through the opening, pushing her way through the narrow gap in the stone. When she emerged on the other side, she found herself in a small, isolated cavern. The walls were damp, the air musty, and the ground covered in leaves and dirt. And there, huddled in the corner, was Max. His fur was matted with dirt, his eyes wide with fear, but there was no mistaking him. It was Max. He looked up at her, his tail wagging weakly, but he remained still, as if waiting for her to come to him. As Sarah approached, she could see the faint signs of injury on his paws and his coat. He was exhausted, hungry, and covered in cuts and bruises, but he was alive. And that was enough for Sarah. The sight of him, the reunion she had dreamed of for so long, was finally real. She rushed to him, kneeling down and pulling him into her arms. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered his name over and over. Max, I found you. I found you. But as Sarah held him close, her thoughts swirled with even more questions than before. How had Max ended up here? Who had put him in the cage? And why? The mystery was far from over. Max's reunion was overwhelming, emotional, joyous, and yet, in the back of Sarah's mind, a nagging sense of unease lingered. As she cradled Max in her arms, his exhausted body resting against hers, she was keenly aware that something was not quite right. Max had been missing for 7 days, and though he was alive, there was a strange emptiness in his eyes. His once playful and trusting demeanor had shifted to something more guarded. His coat was matted, his paws cracked and worn, and his body trembled slightly, as if the ordeal he had endured had left a deep, lasting mark on him. Sarah carefully helped Max out of the small cavern and made her way back to the opening in the rock. She didn't want to leave him for too long, but the questions pressing at the back of her mind wouldn't let her go. She had to know what had happened. Why had he been locked up in that cage, and how had he ended up trapped in such a remote, hidden place? As she emerged from the woods and back into the sunlight, she noticed that Max was walking slower than usual, as though every step he took was a struggle. Her heart sank. Something had happened to him that she couldn't fully understand yet. And she was determined to find out. After checking Max into the car, Sarah decided to return home and let him rest, but she couldn't ignore the strange phone call she had received just days earlier. The voice on the other end had been cryptic, the words spoken in a way that seemed almost rehearsed, as if someone knew more about Max's disappearance than they were letting on. Max is in the woods, the caller had said, but you'll need to be careful. There's more to this than you know. The message was chilling, and the vague tone only added to the fear and confusion Sarah was already feeling. It was clear that whoever had made the call had been watching, had been aware of her search, and perhaps even had knowledge of things Sarah wasn't ready to face. Sarah sat in her car, staring at the phone in her hands, wondering whether she should call the number back. She felt a deep, unshakable sense that the truth was just out of reach, hidden behind layers of deception. The problem was that whoever had called her hadn't given her any real answers, only more questions. Why had they known about Max? How could they have been so sure of his location when no one else had been able to find him? She couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that this was all part of something much larger. Max's disappearance had not been an accident, and whoever had taken him, or at least hidden him, was involved in something dark and twisted. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Sarah's breath caught in her throat when she saw the name on the screen. It was the same number that had called her earlier. Hesitantly, she pressed the button to answer. Sarah. The voice on the other end was distorted, as though the caller was using a voice modulator. I see you found him. But you still don't understand, do you? There's more to Max's disappearance than you think. Who is this? Sarah's voice trembled as she spoke, trying to hold onto the last remnants of her composure. "What do you want?" The voice on the phone chuckled, a hollow sound that made Sarah's skin crawl. "I want you to understand, Sarah. You've only just scratched the surface. Max wasn't just lost. He was taken. And if you think this is over, you're wrong." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "What do you mean? Why would someone take him? Where has he been? Tell me." Her frustration mounted, but the voice only grew more cryptic. "You'll find the answers in the woods. Follow the trail, if you're brave enough. The truth will come to light, but be careful, Sarah. There are those who don't want the past to resurface." The call ended abruptly, leaving Sarah with nothing but her racing thoughts and the ominous words echoing in her mind. Max stirred beside her, his head resting on her lap as if sensing her distress. She reached down and gently stroked his fur, trying to calm herself. The caller had said something important. Something that made her realize that Max's disappearance was part of something much bigger, something that wasn't just about him. But what? And why was she being drawn into this mystery? Her mind flashed back to the cage in the woods, the rusty old metal that had been buried beneath the leaves and earth. Why had Max been placed in that cage, and who had been responsible for it? More than just a kidnapping, this felt like a carefully orchestrated plan. The caller's words hinted at a history that Sarah was only beginning to understand. There were people involved in this, people who had been hiding the truth for a long time. What were they trying to protect? And what were they willing to do to keep it hidden? Determined to get answers, Sarah knew she couldn't back down now. She had to return to the woods. But this time she wouldn't go alone. She would bring help, she would be prepared, and she would uncover whatever it was that had led Max to that hidden cave. The mystery of his disappearance had just begun to unfold, and Sarah was not going to stop until she had the answers she needed. As the hours passed, Sarah found herself making arrangements. She called a few trusted friends and even reached out to a local investigator she had worked with in the past. Together they would follow the strange, mysterious trail and uncover the dark forces at play. Sarah didn't know what she would find, but she was ready. For Max. For the truth. The following day, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the search for Max's abductors was only just beginning. As the sunlight filtered through the trees, she stood in the forest once more, this time with the local investigator Tom by her side. Tom was a quiet man, not one for dramatic flair, but his sharp instincts had served him well over the years. He had seen cases like this before, animals going missing, strange calls and hidden motives, but never one that felt quite like this. There was a palpable sense of danger in the air, and Tom could feel it too. "Whatever's going on here," he said quietly, "it's bigger than just some random dog theft." "I know," Sarah replied, her voice thick with determination. "Max wasn't just taken. This is something planned. There's a reason for it. And I won't rest until I find out what it is." They walked in silence, following the path Max's paw prints had left behind. The farther they went into the woods, the more Sarah could feel that something was off. The air seemed to grow colder, and the familiar sounds of nature, birds chirping, leaves rustling, began to feel eerily absent. A sense of unease crept up her spine. They were getting closer to something, but Sarah wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. After some time, Tom paused, scanning the surroundings with a furrowed brow. "Over here," he muttered, stepping off the trail to the right. Sarah followed, her heart racing. As she approached, she saw what he had noticed, a large, weathered wooden door, partially obscured by thick undergrowth. It was set into the side of a hill, hidden beneath layers of moss and vines, like it had been deliberately concealed. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "What is this?" she whispered. Tom crouched beside the door, brushing away the vines. "Looks like an old storage bunker, maybe. This place wasn't on any maps. It's not a place people know about." With the door now mostly clear, Tom slowly turned the rusted handle, the metal groaning in protest. As the door creaked open, a musty, damp smell escaped from the dark interior. The faint light from the outside barely penetrated the gloom inside. Sarah hesitated for a moment but then stepped forward, her heart pounding. Whatever had been hidden here for so long was important, and she had to know what lay inside. They cautiously descended into the bunker, which was surprisingly large for a structure so hidden. Inside they found a room that looked like it had been abandoned for years. Dust and cobwebs clung to the walls, but the place wasn't completely empty. Along the far wall were several cages, rusted and old but still functional. The type of cages Sarah had seen in the woods. And as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she realized something far more disturbing. There were marks on the ground that appeared to have been dragged, leading to a pile of old, discarded blankets in one corner. There was also a faint, metallic scent in the air, the same smell she had noticed before. It was unsettling, as if the room held secrets too dark to imagine. Max wasn't the only one, Sarah murmured, her voice trembling. Tom was already inspecting the cages, his brow furrowed in confusion. No, looks like he wasn't. This place has been used for something much worse. As Sarah looked around, a sinking feeling overwhelmed her. This was no ordinary animal shelter or abandoned facility. It was a place designed to keep something, or someone, trapped. The cages, the discarded bedding, the marks on the floor, all pointed to one horrifying truth. Max hadn't just been lost, he had been held captive along with other animals. But who had done this? And why? Suddenly, Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She fumbled to answer it, her hands shaking. It was an unknown number. The voice on the other end was familiar but chilling. "I see you found the bunker," the voice said, this time without the modulator. It was a man's voice, low and cold. "You're getting too close, Sarah. If you want to keep digging, you'll regret it." "Who are you?" Sarah demanded. "Why are you doing this? What happened to the dogs you've been keeping here?" The man laughed, but there was no humor in it, only a dark, unsettling edge. "You're asking the wrong questions, Sarah. This isn't about you. It's about Max. And the truth you're not ready to face." The call ended abruptly, leaving Sarah stunned and speechless. Her hands gripped the phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The world around her seemed to spin as the reality of what she had discovered began to settle in. Max wasn't just the victim of a random act. He had been targeted, specifically. And someone knew exactly what she was doing. Someone was watching and they were warning her to stop. "Who was that?" Tom asked, his voice laced with concern. "It was him," Sarah replied, her eyes scanning the room, her pulse racing. "The person who took Max. They know we're here. They know everything." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling in. Sarah felt a new sense of urgency. This was no longer just about finding Max. It was about uncovering a larger, darker operation that had been hidden beneath the surface of her quiet town for far too long. Whoever had been behind it wasn't just holding dogs in this bunker. They had something much more sinister planned. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice filled with resolve. "We need to take this to the authorities. We've seen enough to know that Max's disappearance wasn't random. This is connected to something much bigger." As they made their way out of the bunker, Sarah's mind raced with new questions. What had Max been a part of? Who else had been taken, and how many victims were there? The man's words echoed in her mind, "The truth you're not ready to face." What was the truth? And was Sarah truly prepared for it? The chilling phone call, the discovery of the bunker, and the cryptic warning from the mysterious man haunted Sarah as she drove back to town. The once familiar world of her small suburban neighborhood now felt distant, as if everything she had known was slipping away, replaced by a darkness she could barely comprehend. She tried to steady her shaking hands on the wheel, her eyes focused on the road ahead, but her mind was in turmoil. Every thought kept returning to that bunker, the cages, the smell of iron, and the unmistakable feeling that something far larger than a simple animal kidnapping was at play. As Sarah parked her car outside her home, she realized she couldn't keep this to herself anymore. Max's ordeal was just the tip of the iceberg. Whatever was happening in the woods, whatever conspiracy had been going on for so long, needed to be exposed. But how? And to whom? Sarah knew she couldn't tackle this on her own. The local authorities might be able to help, but they had always seemed so disconnected from the depth of what was happening. She needed someone with more experience, someone who had dealt with dark, underground operations. The first person who came to mind was a former detective, Tom's old partner, Kate. Kate had left the force several years ago but had built a reputation for solving complex and often dangerous cases, ones the police couldn't handle. Sarah had worked with her in the past and she trusted her instincts. Without wasting any time, Sarah dialed Kate's number. "Kate, it's Sarah. I need your help," she said urgently when Kate answered. "Of course, Sarah. What's going on?" Kate's voice was calm, but Sarah could hear the concern in it. "I found something big. I can't explain it all right now, but it involves Max, and there's something much darker happening in this town than anyone realizes. I need you to help me investigate. I need you to help me bring this to the light." After a long pause, Kate replied, "I'll be there in an hour. Stay safe. We'll figure this out." The conversation ended, but Sarah could feel a sense of relief wash over her. She wasn't alone in this anymore. With Kate by her side, they would get to the bottom of it no matter how deep the rabbit hole went. As the hour passed, Sarah felt the weight of the situation settle deeper into her bones. Max lay beside her on the couch, his head resting on her lap, but his unease was palpable. Despite being home safe and sound, he had yet to return to his old, carefree self. He still flinched at sudden movements, and his eyes darted to the door every time someone knocked. Max had been through something traumatic, and it was clear that whatever had happened in the woods had affected him in ways Sarah couldn't fully understand. When Kate arrived, Sarah wasted no time in explaining everything she had discovered. She told her about the bunker, the cages, the strange phone call, and the cryptic warning. She shared her suspicions that there was more to Max's disappearance than just a random abduction. It was part of something much darker. Kate listened intently, her face serious. Once Sarah had finished recounting the events, Kate leaned forward, her mind clearly at work. "Okay, Sarah," Kate said, her voice steady, "there are a couple of things we need to do. First, we need to get that bunker inspected by the authorities. They might not believe us at first, but if we can gather physical evidence, scrapings, DNA, anything, we can force them to take this seriously. Second, we need to track down that phone number. Whoever made that call is connected to everything that's going on." Sarah nodded, her resolve growing. "I've already tried to find out who called me, but I don't have much to go on." The number was blocked, and it was a modulated voice. "That's a start," Kate said. "I have some connections at a few tech companies. I'll see if I can trace that number. As for the rest, we need to stay alert. Whoever's behind this doesn't want this to come to light, and they won't hesitate to stop us if they think we're getting too close." With a plan in motion, Sarah and Kate set out to gather evidence. They returned to the woods where Sarah had found Max, carefully documenting everything they could: the location of the bunker, the cages, the mysterious marks on the ground, and the strange scent still lingering in the air. They also took photographs of the area, hoping to capture something that might connect the dots between Max's abduction and whatever twisted operation had been taking place in the shadows. The authorities were notified, but for now the local police were keeping their distance, uncertain of how to proceed. It was clear that they needed more concrete evidence before they could make an arrest or a formal investigation. But Sarah wasn't going to wait. The more she thought about the phone call, the more she realized that whoever was behind this knew exactly what she was doing. And they weren't going to stop until they shut her down. That evening, Sarah sat in the living room, staring at the phone, her hands trembling as she waited for an update. Kate had promised to trace the number, and Sarah desperately hoped that something would come of it. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the sound of Max's soft breathing as he lay next to her. It was nearly midnight when the phone rang. "Sarah?" Kate's voice was urgent. "I've got something. That number you gave me, it's registered to a warehouse on the outskirts of town. I don't have all the details yet, but it's connected to a company that specializes in animal research. It's all very hush-hush, and there's something shady about their operations." Sarah's heart raced. This was the break they had been waiting for. "Where is it?" she asked, already standing up. "I'm sending you the address now. But be careful, Sarah. If this is as big as we think it is, there are people involved who won't hesitate to silence you." With the address in hand, Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline. The truth was out there, just within her grasp. But she also knew that this discovery would be the most dangerous thing she had ever faced. And the closer she got to the truth, the more she could feel the darkness closing in. The address Kate had provided led them to a secluded warehouse at the edge of town, surrounded by industrial buildings and abandoned lots. The night was dark, the air thick with tension, and the only sound was the distant hum of machines. Max, who had been unusually quiet and alert since his return, sat nervously at Sarah's feet in the car. He could sense that something was off, just as Sarah had. The unease that had followed her since his disappearance hadn't fully dissipated. If anything, it had grown stronger. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to walk into something dangerous, something far beyond what she had imagined. Kate's voice came through the earpiece. "We're close. Let's stick to the plan." We go in quietly, find the evidence, and get out before anyone notices. Sarah nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. The adrenaline coursing through her veins kept her sharp and focused. She knew they were closer than they had ever been, to unraveling the truth behind Max's disappearance, and the horrible operation that had been happening right under their noses. The warehouse was old, its exterior covered in peeling paint and rust, as if it had been abandoned for years. But there was something about the place that didn't seem right. Lights flickered on the inside, and there was a faint hum of activity coming from within. As they approached, Sarah felt the weight of the moment. They had to be careful. This wasn't just about rescuing Max anymore, it was about stopping something far darker from continuing. Kate gestured for Sarah to stay low and follow her, and they crept toward the side entrance of the warehouse. Sarah's eyes scanned the area, looking for any signs of movement. The air was heavy with the scent of metal and something faintly chemical, a smell that seemed to gnaw at the back of her throat. She could feel Max's presence beside her, his body tense as he followed closely, his instincts on high alert. They reached the door and Kate carefully turned the handle, easing it open. The door creaked slightly and both women froze, holding their breath, but the sound of the warehouse's inner workings drowned out the noise. They slipped inside, their steps soft but deliberate. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of boxes, large crates, and dimly lit corridors. The hum of machines grew louder as they moved further into the building, and Sarah felt a sense of foreboding settle deeper into her bones. This wasn't a typical storage facility. The atmosphere here was cold and sterile, as if it existed solely for the purpose of something much more sinister. They continued down the corridor, keeping to the shadows. Sarah's eyes darted around, searching for anything that might reveal the operation's scope. Suddenly, she caught sight of something that made her stomach churn. A row of cages lined up against the far wall, each one containing a dog. Some were familiar breeds, like beagles and pit bulls, while others were less recognizable. Their eyes were wide with fear, and their fur matted and unkempt, just like Max's had been when she found him. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. These dogs weren't being kept as pets. They were being held for something far more twisted. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, her heart hammering in her chest. These animals were victims of something she couldn't yet understand. But she knew it had something to do with Max's disappearance. The dogs, all of them, had been taken just like Max to be part of a much darker plan. Her suspicions were confirmed when she noticed the sterile, cold medical equipment scattered on a table nearby. Kate, too, had noticed the cages and began taking photos, documenting everything they could for the police. "This is beyond what we thought," Kate muttered under her breath. "We need to find the person in charge." The two women crept deeper into the warehouse, moving past the rows of cages, trying to stay as quiet as possible. They reached the far end of the warehouse, where they found a set of large double doors. The sound of voices came from inside, low, hushed voices that made Sarah's stomach twist. Someone was here, someone who could explain everything. Taking a deep breath, Sarah nodded at Kate, signaling her to open the doors. Together they stepped into the room beyond. Inside, the room was large and sterile, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. It resembled a medical laboratory but with an unsettling twist. A set of metal tables stood in the center, covered with instruments that looked as though they belonged in a nightmare. Papers and files were scattered around, some open and others half buried beneath piles of notes. But it wasn't the equipment that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was the man standing in the center of the room, surrounded by monitors and machines. He was tall, wearing a lab coat, his back to them as he stood in front of a computer screen, oblivious to their presence. His demeanor was calm, detached, eerily so. But Sarah knew without a doubt that he was the one behind everything. He was the person who had orchestrated Max's abduction, and the abductions of the other dogs as well. He was the mastermind behind this twisted operation. "Who are you?" Sarah demanded, stepping forward. Her voice was loud and unwavering, and the man turned slowly, his expression unreadable. But when his eyes met hers, a cold, calculating smile spread across his face. "You must be Sarah," he said, his voice smooth and collected. "I've been expecting you." "How do you know me?" Sarah asked, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. "I know all about you," he replied, his voice unnervingly calm. "You've been poking around in places you shouldn't. You've uncovered things that were never meant to be found. But now that you're here, you might as well know the truth. Max was never meant to be a pet. He was chosen for a purpose just like the others. Sarah's blood ran cold as she processed his words. Max wasn't just a victim of some random abduction. He had been selected. But why? And what was the purpose of this sick operation? You've been stealing animals for years, Sarah said, her voice shaking with disbelief and anger. But why? What were you doing with them? The man's smile widened as if he enjoyed the suspense. We've been conducting research. Research that some people would rather remain a secret. These animals were never just for adoption. They were test subjects, part of a much larger plan. And now that you've found us, we'll have to make sure you don't leave with this information. Before Sarah could react, a group of masked men in dark clothing entered the room, blocking the exit. It was clear that they had been waiting for this moment. But Sarah wasn't going down without a fight. She reached for her phone and signaled Kate to make a run for it, sending a message to the authorities. The final battle to stop the operation had begun. And no matter what, Sarah wouldn't stop fighting for Max, the other dogs, and the truth. The tension in the room was unbearable. As the masked men moved in, their presence only added to the sense of impending danger. Max, sensing the change in atmosphere, growled lowly at the men, but his body still trembled with the memory of his captivity. Sarah stood her ground, the adrenaline from the discovery of the lab giving her the strength she needed to face what came next. She had come too far to back down now. This wasn't just about Max. It wasn't just about the other dogs. This was about bringing an end to a dark conspiracy that had been operating right under her nose for far too long. Kate, get out of here. Sarah shouted, her eyes fixed on the men advancing toward her. Call the police. I'll hold them off. Kate didn't hesitate. With a quick nod, she bolted for the exit, her footsteps echoing as she ran, a determined look on her face. Sarah knew she was running on borrowed time. Every second counted. The man in the lab coat watched her intently, an unsettling calmness in his eyes as if he had all the time in the world. He wasn't worried, but Sarah had no intention of letting him control the situation. You think you can just walk out of here with the truth? The man asked, his tone cold and mocking. You're too late. You've already seen too much. I'm not leaving without answers, Sarah replied, her voice firm, despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Why, after everything, why Max? Why these animals? What was the purpose of your research? The man chuckled, the sound echoing in the sterile lab. You really don't understand, do you? These animals, they're part of something bigger. We've been testing their reactions, studying their behavior, their intelligence, their loyalty. There's a market for it, you know. What we're doing is vital for scientific advancement. But you, he paused, his smile widening, you're just a nuisance. You don't belong here. Sarah's fists clenched. His words sickened her, and her instincts screamed at her to do something. The truth, the real truth, was out of reach, but she wasn't going to let him walk away. She would expose him no matter the cost. Just as the man took a step toward her, the door behind him suddenly burst open, and a team of law enforcement officers stormed into the room. Kate had done it, she had called for backup just in time. The officers quickly apprehended the man and his associates, pinning them down with precision and force. For a brief moment, Sarah allowed herself to breathe a sigh of relief. The nightmare was finally over. Max, still on edge but sensing the shift in power, took a tentative step forward, his tail low but wagging slightly. Sarah crouched down, her eyes filling with tears as she reached out to him. He was safe. They were both safe. As the officers took the men into custody, Sarah turned her attention to the other animals in the cages. There were dozens of them, dogs, cats, even some exotic animals that had been used in these twisted experiments. Some were in poor condition, others frightened beyond belief, but all of them had one thing in common: they had been victims. Sarah's heart ached for them, but she knew that their suffering was finally going to end. The authorities quickly moved to take care of the animals, ensuring that they would be properly rehabilitated and adopted by loving families. It was a bittersweet moment for Sarah. She had found Max, but there were so many others who had been through unimaginable horrors. Later that evening, as Sarah sat on the porch with Max curled up beside her, she reflected on everything that had happened. The past week had been a whirlwind: discovery, danger, and finally resolution. The truth about the underground operation, the tests, the illegal activities, and the twisted motives of the people involved had come to light. But the victory was bittersweet. While Max was safe, and the animals would eventually find new homes, The darkness that had been lurking in the shadows of her town had left scars that wouldn't easily heal. Still, Sarah was grateful. Grateful for Max, who had fought to survive and found his way back to her. Grateful for Kate, who had stood by her side through it all. And grateful for the community that had rallied behind her, proving that sometimes, when the worst happens, there is hope. There is always hope. Max, now settled comfortably beside her, looked up at Sarah with those trusting eyes she had missed so much. And for the first time in days, Sarah smiled. Max had returned to her, and although the journey had been harrowing, their bond had only grown stronger. Together they had faced the unimaginable, and together they would move forward. The nightmare was over. The truth had been exposed. And Sarah knew one thing for certain: she would never let anything happen to Max again. Months passed and life slowly began to return to normal. The criminal operation was dismantled, its members arrested and charged with a range of crimes. The animals rescued from the warehouse were rehabilitated and adopted into new homes, some even finding their way back to their families. Max, still cautious but healing, became the heart of Sarah's home once more. His playful nature, though scarred by his experience, began to emerge as he grew more comfortable. Sarah used her experience to advocate for animal rights, speaking at local events and working with organizations dedicated to preventing animal cruelty. She never forgot the dogs she had seen in that warehouse, the innocent creatures who had suffered for far too long. But she also knew that, through it all, Max had been her guide, her strength. Together they had uncovered the truth, and in doing so, had made the world a little bit safer. As Sarah and Max sat on the porch one warm evening watching the sunset, she knew that they had been through the worst, and they had come out stronger. The mystery was solved, but their journey was far from over. And as long as they were together, there was no challenge they couldn't face. The end. With that, the story concludes. Thank you for taking the journey with me. If you find this interesting, please subscribe for more stories and comment below your thoughts. Thanks.